Picture this. It's before dawn in the Jordanian desert, and air defense radar operators are staring at a screen showing 5 inbound missiles heading straight for an American base. Within minutes, all 5 are shot out of the sky. Nobody in Jordan dies that morning, but the message has already landed. A war that started in Iran 5 months ago has just crossed another border. At almost the same moment, fighter jets from 2 air forces that have never fought side by side in living memory, Saudi Arabia and the United States, are dropping bombs on targets inside Iraq. And in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, a quiet diplomatic effort to calm the region has just collapsed. 3 fronts. 1 war. And it is getting bigger, not smaller. In the next 20 minutes, we're going to walk through exactly what happened over the last 48 hours in the Middle East, why Saudi Arabia just made a decision it had avoided for months, why Jordan suddenly finds itself in the crosshairs, and why a narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman could end up mattering more to your gas prices than anything happening on the battlefield itself. This is a story about escalation, the slow, then sudden, way a regional war widens until countries that tried to stay out of it can't anymore. 5 months ago, this conflict was framed as a short, sharp confrontation between 2 countries, the United States and Israel on one side, Iran on the other. Today, it involves Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and indirectly, every country that depends on oil and gas shipped through one of the most important waterways on Earth. Why does this matter to you, even if you've never set foot in the Persian Gulf? Because roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and a significant share of its liquefied natural gas normally moves through the Strait of Hormuz. When that route is disrupted, energy markets feel it within hours, and so, eventually, does everyone who pays for fuel, groceries, or a plane ticket. Beyond the economics, this is also a story about how wars that are declared over on paper have a way of refusing to actually end. So let's build the full picture, starting with how we got here in the first place. To understand why Saudi jets are now flying combat missions over Iraq, you need to rewind to February of this year. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a massive, coordinated military campaign against Iran, hundreds of strikes within a single 12-hour window, hitting missile sites, air defenses, military infrastructure, and senior leadership. The strikes were devastating enough that Iran's supreme leader was killed in the opening hours, along with a number of top officials, throwing the Iranian government into a brief but serious crisis over who would lead the country next. Within days, the regime moved quickly to install new leadership and project stability, even as the war ground on. The stated goal from Washington and Jerusalem was to permanently dismantle Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs and to sever Tehran's support for the network of allied militias it backs across the region, in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and Gaza. Iran responded with retaliatory missile and drone strikes on Israel, and eventually against Gulf states seen as aligned with Washington, including Saudi Arabia. A ceasefire took hold in early April, and by June, the 2 governments had reportedly reached an understanding on a roughly 2-month framework for further negotiations covering Iran's nuclear program and regional security arrangements. That framework, though, never fully translated into calm. Ships kept getting attacked near the Strait of Hormuz. Drone strikes kept hitting Gulf energy infrastructure. And the ceasefire increasingly looked less like peace and more like a pause between rounds. That's the backdrop for everything that happened this week. The strikes on Iraq. Over the past month, U.S. and Saudi officials say Iran-aligned militias operating out of Iraq have carried out roughly 30 drone attacks, a campaign that culminated in strikes on Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure, including facilities in the kingdom's eastern province near Riyadh. Saudi air defenses say they intercepted and destroyed several of the drones before they could do serious damage, but the pattern of attacks was enough to trigger a direct military response. In the early hours of this Wednesday, Saudi Arabia and the U.S. Military Central Command carried out joint airstrikes on multiple sites across eastern Iraq, logistics hubs and weapons depots that American and Saudi officials say were being used to plan and launch the drone campaign. Saudi Arabia's defense ministry was careful to frame this as a defensive response, stating publicly that the kingdom is not seeking a wider war but will respond to attacks against it. This detail matters more than it might first appear. This is reportedly the first time since the war began that Saudi Arabia has publicly acknowledged carrying out strikes inside Iraqi territory. For months, Riyadh had absorbed missile and drone attacks from Iran-aligned groups largely without direct military retaliation of its own, wary of being pulled deeper into an American-Israeli war it never chose to fight. That restraint just ended. The response from Iraq was immediate and angry. Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces, an umbrella of mostly Shia militias that is technically part of Iraq's official security apparatus but includes factions closely tied to Iran, said several of its personnel were killed and wounded, with damage reported to several of its facilities. One of the groups under that umbrella, describing itself as an Iranian-backed resistance movement, denied any role in the drone attacks on Saudi Arabia and called the accusations fabricated, warning of a forceful response to what it called any reckless Saudi action. This points to a structural problem that has bedeviled Iraq's government for years. These militias are nominally under state control, answering in theory to the Prime Minister as Commander-in-Chief, but in practice they've frequently acted on their own, striking American installations or, now, Saudi interests, without waiting for orders from Baghdad. Successive Iraqi governments have struggled to rein them in, and this week's events suggest that problem hasn't gone away. Missiles toward Jordan. At almost the same time, Iran or its allied forces attempted to strike a U.S. base in Jordan. According to Jordan's army, its air defenses intercepted and destroyed 5 missiles before dawn. There's no indication of casualties or significant damage from that attack, but the location itself is significant. Jordan has largely stayed out of the direct fighting in this war, serving instead as a U.S. security partner and a relatively stable buffer state in a turbulent neighborhood. A direct strike attempt against a base on Jordanian soil, regardless of the outcome, signals that Iran or its proxies are willing to widen the map of targets well beyond Iraq and the Gulf states. The Strait of Hormuz standoff. While the fighting in Iraq and Jordan was unfolding, a parallel and arguably even more consequential story was playing out over shipping lanes. For weeks, Oman has been trying to broker a diplomatic fix to the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula that virtually all Gulf oil exports have to pass through. Since the war began, Iran has effectively disrupted normal shipping traffic there, and previous reporting indicates Iranian forces have targeted or intercepted commercial vessels that didn't follow Tehran's rules for passage. Oman's latest proposal reportedly involved splitting the strait into 2 managed corridors, essentially giving Iran and international shipping interests separate lanes to operate in, an attempt at a face-saving compromise that would let commerce resume without requiring either side to fully back down. Iran rejected it. Instead, Tehran is demanding full control over inbound traffic and only partial control over the outbound corridor. In effect, a veto-capable role over which ships get to pass and under what conditions, rather than a shared or evenly divided arrangement. For global shipping companies and their insurers, this distinction is not a minor technicality. A framework where Iran can unilaterally block vessels creates a completely different risk calculation than one where a neutral third party administers separate lanes. As long as this standoff continues, expect shipping traffic through Hormuz to remain well below its pre-war levels, and expect energy markets to stay jumpy every time there's a new attack or a new round of talks. Trump and Netanyahu meet. The same day all of this was unfolding, U.S. President Donald Trump hosted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House for their first in-person meeting since the two countries launched their joint military campaign against Iran back in February. According to statements from both governments, the closed-door talks lasted around 90 minutes and focused heavily on Iran's nuclear program. Officials on both sides described the meeting in warm terms, characterizing it as a productive, closely coordinated conversation, with both leaders reaffirming their shared commitment to preventing Iran from ever obtaining a nuclear weapon. Beyond Iran, the two leaders also reportedly touched on deepening security cooperation and exploring further diplomatic normalization in the region. The friendly tone is notable given the tension that has periodically flared between Trump and Netanyahu since the war began, disagreements over pacing, strategy, and how far to push the campaign against Iran. For now, at least publicly, both sides are projecting unity at a moment when the war is expanding rather than winding down. Why is this happening now? The short answer is that the ceasefire from April was never a real peace, it was closer to an exhausted pause. The underlying disputes that triggered the war in February were never resolved: Iran's nuclear ambitions, its ballistic missile arsenal, and its extensive network of allied militias across the region. As long as those militias remain armed, funded, and willing to act, incidents like the drone strikes on Saudi oil facilities were always likely to happen, and each one raises the odds that a country previously sitting on the sidelines gets pulled directly into the fight. Who is affected? Civilians in Iraq are bearing some of the most immediate cost, caught between militias operating with limited government oversight and foreign airstrikes targeting those militias' infrastructure. Ordinary Saudi citizens near the kingdom's energy facilities face the risk of drone and missile attacks, even when intercepted successfully. In Jordan, a country that has tried hard to avoid entanglement in this war, residents near U.S. military installations now have to reckon with the possibility of being caught in the crossfire of a conflict that isn't theirs. And globally, anyone who buys fuel, flies, or relies on goods shipped by sea has a stake in whether the Strait of Hormuz stays open. Economic impact. Energy markets are the most direct channel through which this war reaches the rest of the world. With roughly a fifth of global oil trade and a substantial share of LNG shipments passing through Hormuz under normal conditions, any prolonged disruption pushes up shipping insurance costs, delays deliveries, and adds upward pressure on fuel prices. Even when tankers aren't directly attacked, the mere threat of disruption is enough to unsettle markets and drive up costs that eventually reach consumers at the pump. Political impact. Inside the U.S., this war intersects with domestic politics as the administration weighs whether to keep pursuing diplomacy with Tehran or authorize further military action, all while trying to manage its alliance with an Israeli government facing its own upcoming elections. In Iraq, the government's inability to fully control militia groups nominally under its own security umbrella continues to strain its relationships with the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and other neighbors, and this week's strikes will likely intensify pressure on Baghdad to act. In the Gulf, Saudi Arabia's decision to publicly strike inside Iraq marks a meaningful shift from a strategy of restraint toward more direct, visible retaliation, a move that could either deter further attacks or invite additional escalation, depending on how Iran-aligned groups respond. International impact. This conflict has stopped being containable within Iran's borders. It now touches Iraq's sovereignty, Jordan's security, Saudi Arabia's energy infrastructure, and Oman's diplomatic credibility as a would-be mediator. Every additional country pulled into direct confrontation makes a broader regional settlement harder to reach, because more governments now have their own grievances, red lines, and domestic political pressures to manage before they'll agree to any deal. What could happen next? A few plausible paths lie ahead. One is further escalation, additional militia attacks on Saudi or American targets, followed by additional retaliatory strikes, gradually normalizing this pattern of tit-for-tat violence across Iraq and the wider Gulf. Another is a renewed diplomatic push, possibly involving a revised Hormuz proposal or a fresh round of nuclear talks following the tone set by the Trump-Netanyahu meeting, though Iran's rejection of Oman's latest offer suggests Tehran currently feels little pressure to compromise. A third, more alarming possibility is a wider strike against Iran's remaining nuclear infrastructure, something Trump has publicly signaled he's willing to consider if diplomacy stalls. Which of these paths the region takes will likely become clearer within the next few weeks, as both the U.S. and Iran calculate how much more risk they're willing to absorb. 5 months after it began, this war looks less like a contained conflict between two countries and more like a slow-motion regional realignment. Saudi Arabia has crossed a line it avoided for months. Jordan has become a target, even if a failed one. A diplomatic effort to calm the seas has collapsed. And the two men steering the American and Israeli side of this war just told the world their alliance is as strong as ever, even as the conflict they started keeps finding new fronts to spread across. The question now isn't whether this war is over. It clearly isn't. The real question is how many more countries get pulled into it before anyone finds a way to actually end it. If you want to stay ahead of how this story develops, subscribe and turn on notifications, because judging by the last 48 hours alone, this is far from finished.